of personal headphones and different channels, but then also closed captioning or having the text on it, right? So there's solutions that, like the closed caption is meant for those who can't hear, but we benefited from at airports or a gym with multiple things. Similarly, most of you have flown, I assume. So airports are real handy. You have a ton of luggage and all kinds of things. You don't like stairs at all. You don't want to open doors. They are very difficult to get through when you have a lot of stuff, things like that. So go to an airport, there's usually no stairs or mostly no stairs, no thresholds on doors. Doors just open widely, they're quite wide, they're very easy to get in and out of. Again, that's because of people with disabilities, but they quite universally all love it. So we might as well design it the other way. And similarly, the ramps on sidewalks to go, they're really nice, whether you want a bike or pushing it like a baby pram or something, but it's actually meant for wheelchairs. This is what very often happens, unfortunately. So I guess the point is to try to get away from this. So universal design, it's really for as many people as possible. Some people will need extra assistance, so that's not gonna work, but it needs to be not stigmatizing. Like which one of these, okay, so the one use second floor is not a product, so that's different one. But when imagine we need to go to the toilet and then you go there and just says not for you. Not particularly nice, right? But all the other products are commercial products and they're like highly advertised that this is amazing. Which one of those would you like to own? Like the medicine dispenser, maybe you don't really need that, but maybe you take like vitamins and supplements or something, so you could technically put it in that. It's ginormous, right? So it's gonna sit outside somewhere, very prominent. The Zoom things are blocking that a little bit. Let's see if I can move it. Isn't that beautiful? Would just love to wear that on your neck proudly around. And obviously, if you're in trouble, that's what that does then. Thanks. That one, there is a version that looks like a piece of jewelry, but then who wants to wear the same piece of jewelry every day? The middle one is kind of assumes that people of older age don't know how to use a phone. So then you have these buttons that you just place the button on the call thing, whether it's your grandchild or whoever Tom is, or you need help, and you place it on that. Wouldn't that be amazing if you had that wherever you live? Kind of better, it's cute, but like no. And then that bathtub, you have friends over and they use your toilet and that's your bathtub. So these are all accessible solutions. They're not universal solutions, so don't make them. Unless somebody really, really needs that, and it's a special case. They're also more expensive when it's made for a niche population, where you could just make it for everybody instead. Very quickly to the context of a design process. Every discipline and everybody has their favorite design processes. I don't really care. They are divided into particular steps and have different level of detail depending a little bit what you emphasize. Do you emphasize the forward planning part? So actually getting it manufactured and out to market, depending a little bit what you do. But here's a very simple version. So it's essentially a double diamond with the engineering at the end. So if you dare, is a double diamond process something anybody has seen? Just like a very shy show of hand if you have seen a double diamond ever. Very few. Okay, so let me talk it through real quick. So just the first two sort of diamond shaped things is a 4-step design process. So in the beginning, you're given a brief, you enter a discover phase. This is the first diamond is a problem space. So you're coming up with what could we do? How could we solve this problem? But you're really trying to understand the problem better. So you actually widen. So the diamond broadening means that the problem area is widening because you're trying to understand the problem and the root causes for that. Then you start understanding what is the most interesting way of solving that, and you enter the define phase, and then you come up with, okay, this is the idea we can develop further. In some engineering companies, that's where you start. So somebody else has done the beginning stuff and they kind of give you a very narrow brief and then you go ahead with that. Then you start developing it, you come with multiple different ideas. How could we solve it? What can we do? And then you start prototyping, testing, and then you deliver a proof of concept. If you're a design firm, that's where you stop. If you're an engineering firm, you keep going and you actually engineer, design it for manufacture, assembly, everything else to be commercially launched at the end. So that's the design process. When I talk about prototyping, or then if we talk about agile we talk about experimentation rather than prototyping, but either way, happens everywhere. So in the beginning, you prototype to understand the problem better. In the middle, you prototype to deliver that successful concept, or it's proof of concept that, you know what, this is gonna have market viability and business viability. And then at the end, you really got a prototype that it can be made, it's gonna work, and so on. So prototyping applies to all those different phases. And I think my examples will too. I'll stick mostly to the beginning because you guys are in a design sprint, so you're not gonna get into the last phase. So I'm gonna stay out of that in this talk as well. Prototype is something that people define differently. So let's start with the definition. So to me, it's the cheapest possible thing to find out an unknown. It's not necessarily physical, it can be virtual, anything, but it needs to be testable. So there's some sort of I don't know this, I'm gonna perform a simple test, something comes back from it, and then I know. And to find out an unknown. So it's not, for example, to demonstrate, look how cool. That's not a prototype. This is my super simple, 3-phase guide how to plan prototyping, especially in the early phases, but it kind of works at the end as well. So why, what, and what do you expect to learn? So the first one is a big hurdle. Why? If you don't know why you're doing something, just don't. There needs to be that, what's the unknown? What's the key thing I want to find out? And it's never for the whole concept. Prototyping is for part of the concept or one perspective of the concept, right? So kind of what is it about that? What is the unknown? What's the assumption I need to test? So you start from that. Then the what is, what do you actually do? Are you building something? Are you simulating something? Are you creating some sort of visualization for feedback? What is it that you're actually creating? Who you're going to test it with? Are you just going to test it yourself? What kind of proof do you need? And what is your success? Or what are you measuring from that test? And so on. And the last one is always useful to think about the learnings, because sometimes you plan a test where the answer is something like yes. I'm like, okay, what do I do with the answer yes? What do I actually want to find out from it? I'll go through examples and hopefully that becomes a bit more clear what's meant for that, but it's always useful to think and also kind of pilot or prototype your prototyping just with a friend and see how that's gonna go. And prototyping is not just like to complete, to move forward, but it's also like, oh, that was a bad idea, let's not go to that direction. Either way. Here's a couple that I'm assuming are related to this design sprint. I can be completely wrong because I wasn't present yesterday or this morning. But we have fidelity of low and high. So low fidelity is something very easy, cheap, fast to put together. That does not really represent the final thing. And high fidelity is a lot more closer to the actual final thing you're trying to do. Ideally, we always prototype with users unless it's a purely functional, some sort of a test where user is irrelevant, but we're doing universal design, so most likely you need a user test. Then sometimes either you are in a, say, a 2 to 3 day hackathon where you don't have time to go to users, or you're working with users that are not accessible to you. So sometimes, occasionally you do without actual users, but keep in mind that you're not doing it with users. So you have to also do with real users. At some point in a design sprint, okay, you'll do what you can. In real life, always make sure that you have users. So a couple of things what you can do related to universally designing something. So very low fidelity things to test something just yourself if you don't have access to, say, people with different sort of sensory abilities, for example. You can kind of block your hearing. You can immobilize parts of you. Wearing a backpack on the front and tying it ridiculously close to you so there's no gap is a reasonable imitation of some aspects of pregnancy, not everything. I've been pregnant, so I can say that. But not fully. Similarly with other things, like say you can blindfold yourself. That's not going to match a lived experience of somebody who's actually blind, but helps you think what works and doesn't work when a person can't see. As I toward the right direction, but never think it's an actual copy. But it's a very simple thing to do something. So something that I've run in class lots of times that we use different kitchen appliances and then we block all our senses. So one common learning is that you actually hear when a smoothie is done. You think you look at it, but you actually hear when it's done. And you realize that if you blindfold yourself and it's completely, you have no idea what the buttons are, it's really hard to get on, but you're very comfortable knowing that, yeah, my smoothie is now done. It's easy to do. If you ever do this, have a friend. There needs to be a safety buddy if you're blindfolded. And of course, the high fidelity ones, I assume some people have heard of these, but you can do very elaborate simulations, have really high fidelity aging suits, or simulate particular conditions very well. It's still not going to be the same as a lived experience, but the physical disabilities will be very similar. If somebody is doing something with somebody with a mental disability, talk to me separately. It's difficult to explain. I'll take a little bit of time, but it's actually a really easy test to do, how you can simulate a mental disability, not everything, but a little bit. And then the high fidelity ones, the with user, of course, the low fidelity ones are you make mock-ups, you make actual prototypes, you bring them to users. And then the functional prototypes are then the high fidelity ones at the end, which you may or may not get to in a design sprint. Let me turn to you again. Here's a very simple example, but that's your standard water bottle, right? If these were just all available to you equally, which one would you prefer? Kind of like a middle one. There's a nod for middle one. Anything else? Yeah, I like the middle one too. That middle one was designed, this was in a Singaporean contest, but we talked to a lot of elderly, significant number of elderly, and we did more than water bottle. We did a whole lot of different devices and everyday items. But this was one of the things that people stopped buying certain brands of items and water bottles, for example, and only brought certain type of coffee because it had a different lid that was easy to open. But based on the needs that we found, the middle cap was designed. We also 3D printed, all the different versions, and we also prototyped in that way. But here's just a visual example, something you can do. So the winglets are purely designed for people. It was kind of, so we didn't really have a formal age limit, but we were out and about in Singapore and kind of finding the visibly not so young. And then talking to them, and that's designed purely for them. But then, like the survey here shows on the thing, so we had young and old that we then talked. So the young ones are college students in Singapore, and everybody preferred the middle one, almost everybody. So that's kind of the main message in this one. I'll show you a couple other products. It doesn't always work, and you don't always do a good job. But if you design for whatever that sort of extreme population that has some sort of an issue that you're trying to solve through universal design for that need, but then actually design for everybody and test with everybody to make sure it becomes universal, like that middle cap. So, back to my prototyping plan, how would that go? So the why, what, and the learnings. So you wanted to test, and this was actually in somebody's thesis several years ago, but they wanted to test if a concept developed for needs of the older adults is suitable for general population. So there was that very clear thing that would they like this too? So then what do you do? Well, they created the CAD renderings. In a later step, they did the 3D prints, but initially just with images. Just kind of, because that was quicker and easier to do. And then okay, which one would they prefer? Ask them and find out. And what do you expect to learn? Well, in this case, you just expect to learn the preference. Worked out real easy. Like I said, we did for other ones too. So for seat belts, so there's always a typical redesign a decoy so that it wasn't obvious. It turns out that when you work with elderly, they really like you. And I worked with really nice students, and the elderly really like the students. So whatever you say, do you like this? Yes. So you need to have all these decoys in place so that they could more objectively choose which one they actually preferred. So that's why there's always a deco. I mean, it's right to make, I'm not saying we're always successful with the deco, but we're trying to make it so that it was obviously an improvement to some direction, but had absolutely nothing to do with the needs from the elderly. And most of these are related to pinching ability. So this is your first motion that goes or gets weak when you get old. Yeah, and then gripping comes after that. Whereas on the gas pump, for example, you can do it this way and you can kind of lean on it. There's also safety issues related to that, but way less force is needed that way versus trying to grip like this and pull upwards. The results, I think I have them on the slide. Yeah, so for all of them, the one designed for the elderly was at least equally liked as the current version, except the can opener. And I'm kind of predicting it could be that this had a sort of a soft thing, and then our decoy doesn't have a soft thing, and this doesn't have. So there's too much difference in them, but who knows? We didn't make a can opener for real, so I'm not sure. But for others, it works. So a really handy thing to do. Just design for the other population, test with everybody. That's what I just said, didn't I? Then let's go through a couple examples. There's the text and the picture don't match. Let's see what has happened. Okay, so the text is wrong. Apologies for that, but I'm trying to look at how to encourage retirees to fly. This case is mostly for business travelers, and then as in a lot of different cultures, people are aging and you retire, and these used to be the ones that flew a lot. So then an airline is trying to think that, well, how can I keep them flying? How can I entice them to fly more or keep flying or whatever? So that's the case. The prototypes done as part of that process were some related to, okay, what all could be done and understanding the problem, some were then developing to what. So I'm gonna kind of skip through the storyline of the actual development and only walk through the prototypes. So one of the first ones was testing the assumption that, well, old people can't use technology. And then they decided that, okay, we're just gonna see if they can pair up a headphone, like a Bluetooth, speaker or headphones to a phone, if that's easy or not. So as a sign of, can they use technology? Can we develop technology-based something, right? So again, so instead of developing the final device, it kind of took some technology, that, without making anything real, but they're still testable. So can they use it? What are the issues with it, and so on. But then here, they found it difficult, even though they own cell phones. So they learned that they indeed own cell phones. Some things on the cell phone were more intuitive than others. Connecting the speakers was not one of the things, but they also noticed they were relatively confident in using cell phones. Later, they tried something completely different, that they created these sort of brochures that, hey, would you like to travel with similar-minded people like yourself? Contact us, and here's interesting trips we'll organize with people like you. Kind of friendship making or something like that, encouraging that type of travel. So they created brochures for that, kind of flyers, and we're hoping for contacts from people. Nobody contacted them, nobody did anything. It was either intimidating, it was not attractive. It's great, let's not pursue that direction. But it was very easy to test, a simple test, abandon, bad idea, move on. In this particular process, they have a luxury because they work a full year on it. So about halfway, they take a pause from the most promising ideas and try the wildest idea that they've ever had or they can think of, just to see if they can really shake it up. So in this case, they had found in all their research that, okay, there's a lot of things that you can do about flying, but people actually hate the process. Like, they love the idea of arriving wherever they go and people want to travel. But, arriving multiple hours early to the thing and all the stress of going through the security and finding the place and just everything related to that, how uncomfortable it is, your layovers and everything else. And from the airline point of view, it was very interesting because the problems are at the airports, and that's not what airlines actually are responsible for. So they couldn't really work with that, but then that was still a problem. So what could you do? This was done together with students in Kyoto, so in Japan, and you might be aware of capsule hotels. So then they thought that, what if we had human cargo? A little while, but the purpose here was to test wild ideas. So, okay, so obviously you're not going to test real human cargo. That would be unethical, dangerous, bad, bad, bad. So then the first idea was that, okay, let's have a person fall asleep and then kind of create a virtual reality, reality around them through VR goggles and smells and sounds, so as if they came somewhere and kind of tried to get feedback that what would it be like that you fell asleep and you woke up somewhere else. They went through all kinds of elaborate things to make sure that the person actually fell asleep. So they asked them to stay up and whatever, and then they did it. And well, now they've turned the lights on to get a picture, but it was in dark. And then they tried it like that, but then the people was like it just doesn't feel like it. You obviously still on the couch. VR is not that thing. You have something on your face that's kind of heavy, and it just did not feel like you went anywhere. So they were not able to get any feedback out of that. But the idea was still intriguing. So they decided to iterate it. So they started looking into what is legal. And it got very funny. So you cannot transport people everywhere, but on a train, you can legally have a person in a wheelchair and you can take a train somewhere. So they went through the same process again. Somebody stayed up kind of extra. Then this is a trusted partner. So like they both agreed to this. But then this person fell asleep, was made comfortable on the wheelchair, and it looks gruesome, the thing around the head, but it's actually because when they first kind of fell asleep, you go like, oh, and it's really uncomfortable. So that, but that's like a nice and flexible sort of t-shirt fabric. So it's actually very comfortable supporting the head. I don't want to try that on a plane next time, but but that just there to help the head be comfortable. And that's how they travel. They went to the train station to mimic an airport. They went up and down elevators, and they stayed there multiple hours because that's what you do at airports, right? Then they took a short, I don't know, like a 2-hour train ride somewhere, and then again, elaborate here and there, whatever, at the other station, and then arrived. This is an automatic, like a GoPro or whatever, the guy on the wheelchair had on his lap. It's also, this is kind of snapshot from the time lapse that he was taking off his own journey. No point to it except that they genuinely went through that trip. I don't have pictures from when they arrived, but he really enjoyed it. He woke up in a city he'd never been to. He had a great day there, and it was great. And then they learned a lot too. So first of all, it was comfortable, but you really had to trust the person. And the trust issues became the big thing. So you unconscious somewhere that you are immobile, and somebody just brings you, like, what if they forget you or something else happens? And of course, in a family situation, that everybody goes to the same location and all kinds of things because you're unconscious. But it was very useful to find out like what are the issues related to that. Because technically we could just sleep in a little capsules and go. Anyway, so this is just a very radical idea, but it's kind of challenging when you say that I can't prototype it. I say, yes, you can. You're just not thinking of it. So while that was really interesting idea, that's not anything that's going to happen in the next couple of years. So it was recorded and given to the sponsoring company. But in the meanwhile, then they returned back to a bit more close-term solutions. Some of the ones that they had been exploring very early on, you can tell these are very cheap, quick mock-ups, kind of something trying to mimic a smart passport and a ticket. That what if it was kind of some sort of a digital passport that your boarding pass and everything was something the same. They did a lot of both testing, like service testing, like pretending to be a service person at an airport, and then just talking to users a lot of airports of what are some of the issues. So wayfinding, knowing where things are, how many minutes, and so on. And very interesting, they learned several things, like nobody thinks of it like 20 minutes that way. But the advice they wanted to know, like these are the last toilets before your gate, or turn right after the Louis Vuitton store. Not like, after certain meters, but like a landmark type of situations to turn there. So they learned a lot from that, started prototyping. So you can probably guess that's just a cell phone. But then they put a little mock-up thinking that they gonna make a device that has a round square, if you can't see it, but has like a gate number and a time on it. And then these are not well labeled, which is what they learned, but they kind of how long until something happens and what should you prepared for and where you at and so on. So kind of keeping you up to date. So it's also your boarding pass, but it would have sort of more, I can imagine your boarding pass updating it, whatever there were delays or something. And that was relatively successful, but not in that form, but this is what they finally made up. So this is still just a mock-up of it. But that's the concept. So essentially this became kind of like, in the restaurant, they give you that, the buzzer when you order something, you give in that, and then you give that back whenever you get your meal. So when you check in, you would get this device, you have it at the airport, it guides you around, tells you all kinds of things, the update is always with you. And then when you get on board, you hand it back. The neat thing about that is it's always an airline worker at those both ends, but it supports you in that airport, which is not handled by the airline, if you remember what I said earlier. Very clever concept. Haven't seen it yet. Well, see, this was done a couple of years ago, so we hope that maybe somebody comes up with it, maybe not, but that's one of them. Let's see, I have another story, but I'm prepared to not tell it, but I think we're doing good on time. So just highlighting in that process. So we had a couple of those very early, very quick mock-ups that you were just trying to understand the problem. Like, could it be something like, can we do technology? What if it was a smart boarding pass? Sort of early on here, later, okay, it's starting to take shape. What could it be? And then the final proof of concept, which then would have to get engineered to be final. And this one here sort of confirming that, out of all these different problems, ideas that one had, this was proposed and it was here quickly tested. If that made sense, that would be this spot here when then that making of that would begin. Okay. Returning back, so I'm going to give a couple of practical tips here and then get to another story of the same thing. So again, so prototype is the cheapest possible testable thing to find out an unknown. Couple of things. So if you test with people, you want to make sure that your format matches how you communicate it. I'm not a big fan of prototypes that are just verbal description sketches and so on, but sometimes it's enough. If it's a very new thing or some sort of abstract thing, sometimes it's enough. And obviously lots of screen-based things you can just show as an image, for example. And like even with the bottle cap, it's such a familiar thing that people were able to say an opinion based on a figure, just an image. But it's still like in that project, we did make them for real just to be able to test what it felt like and how it worked and so on. So you want to make it, but anyway, so it could be something as simple as some sort of description. And they, of course, work always face-to-face and some also online. During COVID, we learned a lot of things kind of work online, but it's usually better face-to-face, mostly because you can read the body language of the user testing it. So it's not necessarily what they say, but kind of the reactions that you see. So it's always better face-to-face, but they're feasible online as well. So anyway, so sometimes depending what it is, it's just something that is just pictorial. Could be a video, some sort of animation of what it is, can be a simulated thing. And simulation can be like a digital simulation, or it can be more like realistic one where we sort of act out something and pretend that it's happening, but a human is actually controlling it. It's not automated, but there's a human who's sort of wizard-wazing the thing to make it happen. Or you make mock-ups, sort of non-functional prototypes or very low functional prototypes or actual working prototypes. If they are virtual products, you might be able to share them also online. And then from users, you can get feedback and you can make them do something. If you can make them do something, it's always better. Because they're always like, do you know how to use this? And they'll say, yep. And if you just give them something here, can you, and whatever that is, can you do X with it, whatever the thing is meant for, and no instructions and see if they can use it. A lot more powerful that way. So do actionable things. Would you buy this? It's a good question that you can do that, but you can actually put them somewhere for sale. And this happens both with physical products and online products. So people create like these fake products and just to see if people click on them, or in actual stores, they make things that look like real products. And then when somebody grabs it, usually there's a person who's like, okay, that's just for marketing purposes, but thank you. It's not a real thing. So by so then that person has actually made a decision to buy it rather than asking, would you buy this? But sometimes feedback is useful already as well. And also feedback is faster to get and so on. So that's also something that you can do. But if you really want them to act on something, you do need to usually create a working prototype or some sort of a mock-up or something that to think that what can they do? So they can purchase it, they can attempt to use it, something that they can do with it. And it doesn't have to be functional to test how you would use it. You can kind of imagine and pretend how you would use it, and you'll get data from that. Common pitfalls in prototyping. This comes from somebody else's research, but this is what usually happens. So prototyping without a purpose. Remember, I always had that why in the list. So sometimes like, oh, we have to make a prototype. And then you just kind of make something that looks like it, but it's not really sure that why you did it. And maybe you make it out of materials that make it non-testable. Like, for example, I love Legos. and maybe just because I'm a mechanical engineer, but very few things can be prototyped with Legos because they kind of break apart. And I love building with them, but then you have to think, if you're going to build out of Legos, what's the test? What are the types of tests you can make with a Lego prototype? And sometimes it's actually better to have a picture, or it needs to be something else, but really thinking like what's the purpose? Then often the focus is creating on something that works. So you have your idea and you just need to make something that works. The idea here is to test an unknown. The unknown could be user response. It could be something else. It doesn't have to be, will it work? And it doesn't have to be the whole thing. Like my entire concept that I have in my mind, I'm going to build all of those parts and make sure it works. That's not how it goes. Novices go that way, but experts know to decompose into smaller bits. And if it's a functional prototype, you just do an area of it, like this particular critical functional prototype, that one, before integrating it with the rest of the system. Well, classic common thing is diving into the first good idea rather than exploring the design space fully. So kind of the first diamond, not going all the way broad, but just going with the first idea. Like I showed with the airline example, they had very different ideas, right? They went to all kinds of directions first. And who knows what they would have done if they just gone with their first idea. We all fall in love with our prototypes because you put effort into it, you create it, it becomes amazing. I fall in love with students' prototypes too, they're amazing. But you need to create them to be testable. And then even if the prototype is great, what was the test result? Maybe the prototype is cute, but actually didn't work. So you want to make sure that you make them cheap enough that you dare to break it. And then be aware of it that, okay, you can keep the prototype, but maybe the idea wasn't the best. Sketching is related to just really thinking about it more. So what's the value? So there's not just one way of doing something, but coming up multiple ways of doing the same and sketching it out. And then the fidelity again. So, related to what are you testing? Sometimes people choose very high fidelity because they think they need to engineer something amazing to test it, even though the test can be done with something very simple. Or they create that Lego prototype trying to test some sort of a property that cannot be tested with Legos. So the fidelity was wrong again. Have you seen these? Because this is a workshop on universal design and I'm not the first speaker. But you have architects and stuff, so maybe because these are product-based. I see at least a couple no's, and so I'm gonna assume no. So these come from North Carolina University a couple of decades ago already, but there's 7 principles for universal design, and they're real handy sort of a checklist, whatever you're designing. And they are product-based because they come from an area where people do sort of mostly industrial design, but they translate also to digital things as well as spaces. So equitable use means that everybody can use the same thing. So instead of that toilet, go to a different floor, don't use this toilet. There's just a door. There's no special ramp, nothing. Everybody uses the same door. And again, a supermarket is a nice example that if you have that shopping cart there, you don't want any stairs or thresholds there, and you want the door to open, so does somebody in a wheelchair. Flexibility in use. So depends. So there's a classic case of right-handed and left-handed, but other things too. If you sit in a wheelchair, you end up being a lot shorter, for example. So maybe you can't reach all the buttons or wherever the you don't weigh your vegetables. There's places where you weigh vegetables and you have to sort of press the button. Sometimes they can be really high. So you want to make sure that anybody of any size, any type of ability, or if they're left or right-handed, they can use the thing. Simple and intuitive. So here that classic is so a child can use it. One thing what I like here is thinking a different language. So if you work in a team where you don't speak somebody else's language, make your device, if it's digital, make it so that it's in the other person's language and try to use it in the one that you can't. And if you can, it's intuitive to use. And there's transportation systems like that, right? Sometimes you're really lost in some places, but some places are done really well that even though you can't quite read what's happening, you can still travel. For perceptible information. So that again, it comes to those who need it. So here the idea is, okay, here's a cell phone. And there's somebody with a seeing eye dog maybe in the background. Maybe that's what that's trying to image, but I don't know if you know how people with visual impairments, how they use a smartphone. but they essentially play it like the sound. And I don't even know how many, it's something like 10x or something, like it's way more, like I can't comprehend it, but that's how they used to doing it. It might be more than 10. It's very fast, and they easily go through all kinds of things, and they can be on social media or whatever. Big note on that, make sure you have your alt texts for your figures. Figures are completely meaningless if you don't do the alt version, which is the audio description for an image. Like on my slides, I'm not sure if I did 100% of them. Most of them have that alt thing. So if somebody were to be listening to these slides, they would hear the picture description for them as well. Okay. 5, tolerance for error. To be honest, I don't know what this image is about. It's referring to something. You're hammering with that thing and something bad happens, and it's trying to do that. I'm not entirely sure what that is trying to do, but kind of assume the person's going to use it wrong or something else happens. So how can you make it safer? So one of the classic examples I hear is lawnmowers. So if you're mowing a lawn and it gets stuck, people often turn it around and kind of put their hands there and trying to figure out what's stuck. You better design it so that it doesn't, if it gets unstuck, it's not while your hand is there. And if you start turning it around, it no longer spins. So you have to sort of tolerate this so-called user error, but it's a design error if you don't design it that way. Low physical effort. This is from the American context, but if you've been to the US, their doorknobs are horrible. They're these round things that you hold on and then you turn. They're just silly little things. Anyway, so, but those types of door handles are significantly better, because you don't get that gripping force, and you don't need to have that for that knob that you turn, because these are way easier. They can be also too easy, because like a dog can open them, but then you can just flip it so that you open it by pulling it up, then a dog can't open it. And then this got mentioned already, so size and space appropriate, and make it often enough so it's not so that, oh, you're in a wheelchair, so hold on, I need to actually go. And then if you're in a wheelchair, you learn very quickly where you can and cannot go and how you go to places. So you often have to go around the building somewhere to the other end, and then do something, because that's where the access is. So just make sure that it's everywhere where everybody else has the access as well. Those were the 7 principles. Really nice to-do list. They're highly Googleable. They online in different formats. Now we get the other example, which was where the text was earlier. Does anybody have any questions or anything? So this is my second example, and then I was going to challenge you on your own projects, just to kind of as a takeaway gift to go work on your things after. But anybody have a question so far? All right, well, I'll go on. So somebody had a clever idea that, what if we made this interface that worked on kind of air pressure? So it's kind of like a flute kind of thing, except air pressure, not sound, but the sort of squishy thing that you play like an instrument, and then maybe that's on a gaming device, or maybe that does something else. But this is like the initial concept, that what if we made this? This is not as much universal, it's more prototyping related. But let's go through the why, what, and what are the expected learnings again. So the goal here was, I have 2 versions of this. So for one of the prototypes, the goal was to find out the resolution of an air pressure based interface. And initially with just few. So can we read it? So the imagine is that you have that thing and you have these flutes, and then you just kind of do something. So can it detect 1 or 2 or 3? And what can I read a signal out of that from just air? Well, I think the easiest here, or whatever occurred to them first, was that, okay, do a 3D printed device, instrument it so that it has holes for the air, and then instrument it so you can read the pressure readings from it. And you expect to find out if it can read like single presses, other presses, and differences between the different presses. And if that can be then turned into an input. So that's what they built. It's a digital version of the image. And then in this case, they created 2 of them. And this is a schematic, but this is what they tested. So in this one, they're only showing 3 fingers, but with the same thing, you could test 1, 2, 3, them individually all together, and kind of see if you can read that. And you can. But then the other test was that, well, what would you use this for, and when and why? Then the idea was, okay, let's try to mimic it with something much cheaper. So essentially, they take like a little part of kind of like a garden hose or some sort of flexible tubing, They just cut a piece, very much shape and size like this, but flexible tubing. And then with a little tape, they marked where these sort of holes are where you're supposed to play it. Then they came up with multiple scenarios where that could possibly be used in. And then they just gave the thing like, hey, imagine this is an interface, you can press it or do whatever you want with it. And then it'll create, or it'll interact with your phone, for example, or with some whatever device you connect it to. And I'm going to show you a bike scenario that they did other scenarios as well. But they're going to look at how users would use it and any concerns they had with it and so on. So here you can see it. So it's just like a flexible little tube with a little tape in it. Could have also been just markered in. Very cheap thing, not digital at all. And then they gave the whole lot of bikers and talked to them in different scenarios. So the most common one was using your cell phone, either for like music and shuffling around, taking calls and then going back, or then having your bike on it, but then also needing to take a call, then getting back to the map app. So that was the most common thing where it is, and people had different shapes, handlebars and so on. So they put it to different places and then pretended to use it and describe what works. And a lot of good stuff learned. This was one of the most promising places where people liked it. It sort of had that natural shape. But you notice, for example, in both of these images, the person used it with their thumb. The designer had originally thought that you use it with, your other fingers. But when you're biking and go over bumps, you kind of constantly like that on it. So that I'm just going to do something. So that doesn't work. So it's better that it's on my thumb, which is less critical in bike riding. So a very useful piece of information. There's a whole lot of other things that came out from that, but it just, imagine how simple and dirty that thing, but they knew it works. And now you have sort of a feasible scenario where you could use it, and then you can take those and go forward with it. Again, this one is not for universal design, and that was not part of the project. Maybe it could be designed that way as well, right? It is just a interface that could be used anywhere. And in this case, it assumes people do have hands, at least in one hand. So what all could that be used? And it could, communicate with voice control and other things as well. So with that, I think doing okay on time. Yeah, we're getting close to the end, but not too much out of time. I'm happy to do this as a discussion here, or let you go do your things. I have no idea what you're actually working on. I'm obviously curious. So you don't have to do the why, what, or learnings, but if you're in this phase, it would be very interesting to sort of find out that, okay, first of all, what are you working on? What's the biggest unknown in your thing, kind of the make or break part of your idea that, or what makes it cool? What are some assumptions that you have about your users? Like, what is it? And then, and for that, what do you need to prototype and why? And then of course, what? Okay, you have like a couple hours, I guess, for this. So what's feasible? What can you create? Who can you test it with? Is it yourself? Is it another team? Can you contact somebody? What is it? What is something that you can do within that time? And then what do you want to learn from that? So I just copied the other slide from here, like, so if you do it with yourself, you could be testing, or with somebody, a student who doesn't have the disability, you could sort of mimic that a little bit. I told you if anybody has a cognitive thing, I'm happy to share how to do that. Or then if you actually get to go to the users, can you bring them some sort of visualization or actual mock-up and have them do something? Over a Zoom call is a very easy way of, talking to somebody who's not here right now. And then what do you want to learn from it? We'll really test it so that it's all impressive and you can win the prizes for the design sprint. But that's it from my part. So I'm happy to talk on this, or if you just want to get going and go do that, whatever, you tell me what's next in the schedule. But yeah. Yeah, please.
Only get used to the design that we use in Verify. So it's like, how can we come up with an idea, or how can we notice that, oh, I can use this thing in another way, in the different, because we already get used to it, because we use it in Verify.
So I'm not fully understand. So there's something about that we're so used to doing things one way, and then how do you do the other? How do you change? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so it's like some products we already get used to it because we use it in Verify. But how do we come up with an idea, and how can we notice that way that it's better?
You know what, that is really, really good question, and it's really hard. I have multiple examples where it doesn't work, and I have one big example where it eventually worked. But why did it work in some and others? The significant testing, and you need to know when to give up. So, even if it's better. So, let's see. So one example is, so cell phones. Before the smartphones, they were sort of the candy bar shaped phones. Nobody knows that, but in Finland we had two, so I'm Finnish by birth. So we had two big cell phone manufacturers. Nokia, everybody's familiar with. There's another one. I bet nobody knows what that is. Yeah, so that's point of the story, that nobody knows what the other firm is. But other firm, Benefon, they had by far superior phone in everything. It had all kinds of GPSs and things on it way before any other cell phone manufacturer had them at all. It was just technically far superior to anybody compared to Nokia or international. So Motorola would have been the top one internationally besides Nokia. And just the best. They had done significant ergonomic studies on how people use it and where the buttons should be, because these are non-smartphones, so they had buttons. But they actually flipped the red and the green, so to answer and to hang up on the phone differently, because based on their studies, that's better. But that was opposite to every other phone in the world. And a silly thing like that. Plus, in addition to that, it was also more expensive than others, but they were so proud of the technology. But it wasn't that much more expensive. But it was just that people just hated using it. I don't know how much user studies they did, because they did like ergonomic study, which is more based on your motion than user feedback, which is, again, what do you want to find out? Which one's easier? So if you talk to like a physiotherapist, how you're supposed to do things, and then how do you really do things? Two different things. Right. So that had a good study. It failed. I was involved in dental chairs. The way a dentist and the dental hygienist use the chair to go up and down, and they even operate the instruments, turn them on and off with their foot. There's like a pedal, like if anybody's in like a sewing machine or anything like that, it has you can't see my feet, but like there's like a lump on the floor, and you sort of press, and there's buttons on it. You can press it to go, you can lift it, do things with your foot, because your hands are, in gloves and in the patient's mouth, right? So your foot drives everything, the chair and the powers the instruments. There's two types. So there's one where you sort of swing it this way, another one where you go this way. And it's kind of like the PC Mac thing, and then it's one or the other, and you hate the other. Very difficult. So they did significant testing, and you just kind of have to choose or then make both. But one where it worked really well is the wheel. So the very first cars, does anybody know how you steered the very first cars? You had levers, because you went from horse carriages, but you sort of had this, you went to levers, and that's what you had. And then the wheel was just the weirdest thing. But imagine now that like we're coming up with semi-autonomous and eventually fully autonomous vehicles. How does a person take over? Like the steering wheel takes a huge space in that area, and we don't technically need it. And, but then it's so intuitive. So I'm just making your problem worse. I think it's a very intuitive question, right? But like, how would, so obviously it worked from that, but then imagine replacing steering wheels. So my suggestion would be significant testing. And then if the users just won't use it, they don't like it, then it's not commercially viable. So it's just not going to work. So you have to do something else. Cool. Difficult problem, very insightful question. Other questions? Yeah.
So the project show is very interesting regarding like the one that sitting on the wheelchair getting transferred.
Mm-hmm.
And then you mentioned about if it's not commercially viable, usually it would just fail. I was wondering, like, that project, or how did it get the funds? Like, how did they get the money in order to do the experiment? How did they convince and be able to kind of reach to the testing user base? Yeah.
So first of all, so this is you get money up front because you're challenged, you're given the brief, like the brief was wrong on my slide, but how to make retirees fly, those who have flown before, how to make them fly and keep flying and using the airline services. That was the brief. Team was given a lump sum of money that this is your budget for a year to come up with the best possible concept for that. So that's how that got funded. But it's like just for that project, okay, it's kind of the first two diamonds, that this is how much we think it's worth to have that concept, as well as know like the ways that don't work, right? And other potential ideas. So all those, what don't work get recorded for the company, anything that potentially works, the learnings for that get recorded. And then the final one, we think this is the best one, and then that they get as a proof concept. So that all made it worth it. And then there's a separate calculation then, okay, is it worth actually making and doing that last bit, and it's not mass manufacturing and so on. But then how to get subjects. So in this case, it was done with one subject only, and because it required significant trust to find a person who was willing to be unconscious. Well, I guess not for, but asleep, in a really deep sleep, and be carted around to a previously unknown location to them by means that they didn't know how. So they got lucky. And
assume that if they be able to get more out of it to fly, they can get like more money. So
well, I guess they were afraid of losing money, because of the aging population, we're going to have way more retired people than we have working people. So earlier, these people were all flying, and then they retire, so you're losing money. So kind of just not even making more, but kind of maintain that the people that fly. Yeah. Anything else? Cool.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I think you guys can, so this is our afternoon workshop, and after that you guys can keep on tracking or doing the design